So verse 3 continues what we've just seen, and it says, Vayomer Elohim Yahi Or. Wahi Or. So Omer here is the word to say Amar. The Yod here is the marker for the imperfect form, and it is currently here in the third masculine singular, imperfect. Of course, because the subject is Elohim. We see Elohim here without the definite article. I also want to point out that the form of the verb here with the Yod, although it looks like a simple indicative, is in the jussive. The jussive, remember, is the third person imperative that is seen in the Hebrew language, which implies some type of command, but in the third person instead of the second person. So this verb here then would be translated, let there be, or let light be. The next word, of course, is the light, or. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, light here is in the singular form. It is not in the plural form, as we would see elsewhere. This is bringing us back to the previous segment where we discussed the allusion that is made in John chapter 1 with Genesis chapter 1 and the presence in Genesis 1 of the word of Yahweh that is functioning in the creative work on behalf of the Father. Another theme that we also see in John chapter 1 is also the life. In fact, John makes the point that in him, which is the word, was life, and the life was the light of men. It's a pretty important thing to observe here, that the command that is about to take place, let there be light, is a command that is the fundamental principle of life that is to follow. In other words, the statement, let there be light, was the fundamental principle in the will to create living things in existence. But there is another very important point that this light hints at a few verses later in verses 14 of this same chapter. But let's look at the text here first, and let's see what happens. The next word is Wahi Or, and there was light. The light, the Or, is the subject, again, of these verb pairs. There is also another thing that I would like to point out here, and that is the creation of time in and of itself. This is not the beginning of the first day. This is the middle of the first day, and you will see why here in a second. In other words, Elohim began to create 12 hours before the current statement that was made. That was a recognizable condition distinct from anything before that 12-hour period. I want to move on to the fourth verse, and then you will see what I mean a little bit clearer. The next verse, verse 4, Vayar Elohim et haor. So the word here, or the verb here, is see. This is with the walk consecutive. And again, although the verb here is in the imperfect form, with the walk consecutive, it reverses the action essentially, and it is treated here as a past verb. And Elohim saw the light that it was tov. Of course, the first time the word tov occurs, but this word will continue to be used 7 times here in Genesis chapter 1. Elohim saw the or, the light, that it was good. Verse 4 says, and Elohim divided between, or bein ha'or uvein ha'choshech. Elohim divided between the light and between the darkness. Now, it's important to understand that this light is a 12-hour boundary. The previous half of this verse, which is at the beginning of verse 2, there was a 12-hour of the darkness that we saw there when Elohim, when the spirit of Elohim, merachefet al panei hamayim. What do I mean here? Let's take another look and see exactly what this really means. Elohim divided between the light and between the choshech. The next verse, verse 5, says, Vaychra. So the word chara here is the actual word to either call out, to name, to read, even, depends on the context in which it is used. Here we can see that the kara is obviously referring to the naming process that is occurring. The choshech received the name Laila, the or received the name Yom. And then it continues, Wahi erev, wahi bocher, Yom echad. So what do we see here in verse 5 at the completion of this one day. I like to use that term, Yom Echad. Couple things. The first thing we learned here is that the last statement in this verse says that there was evening, Waihi Erev, Waihi Bocher, Yom Echad. Notice that the evening preceded the morning. The days in the biblical times begins with the evening of the previous day. Say, for example, the Shabbat begins at sunset of the previous day. In other words, the day begins 12 hours before the first light appears of the day. So what we see here is the evening and morning comprising the first Yom Echad, okay? So here, day is now defined for us by this statement here. Day is defined as a 24-hour period, as it includes the evening and the morning. Now, there are some individuals who would like to see the day here as a large number. However, based on the context of Genesis chapter 1, we are clear and we are certain that this passage refers to a period of 24 hours. However, there is a second additional meaning to the word yom, which is daylight itself. We just saw here in Genesis chapter 1 verse 5 that Elohim called the light yom. So if Elohim called the light yom, then the word yom also encompasses 12 hours, roughly approximately 12-hour period of time. So the word day itself can mean a 12-hour period. It could mean a 24-hour period in the full understanding of a yom and laila, but it can also refer to a period of time as well, as in the day of Yahweh, as discussed in prophecy. So the word day, once we understand the various meanings that it can entail, now we are equipped to have a perfect understanding of exactly what occurred here in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. For a 12-hour period, the Ruach Elohim was preparing to correct something that became in a state of destabilization and chaos and darkness. Verse 3 then continues, then Elohim said, let there be light, and light was. And Elohim saw the light that it was good. And Elohim separated between the light and between the choshech, the darkness. And Elohim named the light day, and the darkness he named night. And there was evening and there was morning one day. So what do we see here in Genesis 1 verses 1 to 5 is a marvelous illustration of a process in which Elohim took a state of darkness, a state of chaos, a state of disorder, and he brought it back into a place to be inhabited. And this is a message the opening verses of Genesis provides us with regards to the struggle between that which is good and that which is evil. Now, what is the light? Because we know it is not luminary bodies which were created on the fourth day, but there is some very interesting thing that we can learn about this light from the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation tells us that Elohim, Yahweh Elohim, is light, and the Lamb, remember, two distinct beings. The Father is the great first cause. The Lamb is indeed the Son of Elohim, the only one who has been exalted to the position to receive all the praise that Yahweh himself could receive. The light himself is Yahweh, the first cause, but the lamp is also the Lamb as well. And there is no night in the kingdom, what Elohim truly intended for mankind. So the light here in Genesis 1 is a very, very important thing for us to understand in light of what Elohim is about to do. But again, Genesis 1, 1 to 5 informs us of a very powerful thing. The source of this light is none other than Elohim. But what you understand is that the Father himself is using his word to bring light into this world, to bring life into this world. And that is the connection with this chapter and the first chapter of John. It's a beautiful journey that we can encounter and we will encounter because there's so much more to see in this first chapter of Genesis. And so I encourage you to stick around and join us, and you'll be tremendously thrilled by what we have to offer. Shalom Aleichem.